Okay, it is 1:04 p.m. and I'll go ahead and call this meeting to order of the Subcommittee on Data Analysis. Mr. Vogel, would you go ahead and do a roll call for us, please?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Ms. Basham. Ms. Basham. All right. Ms. Evans. Ms. Evans. Mr. Gaffin.
Present.
Thank you, Mr. Gaffin. Mr. Kammer.
Present.
All right. Ms. Robertus.
Present.
Mr. Sandoval. Mr. Sandoval. All right, Mr. Chair, 3 of the 6 members are present. We're 1 shy of a quorum, but I'll let you know if someone comes in and we reach quorum.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Okay, so we are going to bypass adoption of our previous meeting minutes since we are just shy of having a quorum. We will come back to that later. Let's go ahead and move on to discussion on data analysis topics. Chairs of the subcommittees met yesterday, and one of the requests that we've had is to just take another look at preponderance of the evidence, just to see if there's anything else there that might be able to be analyzed that would provide any additional data. Along with that, Mr. Vogel has been collecting some data on preponderance of the evidence. We might say POE today, but POE from other states. So Mr. Vogel will share some of what he has collected. And one of our tasks will be talking about how we might display that data in a way that would be helpful to other members of the task force as a whole. So I think that is probably our biggest analysis task today to take a look at. In addition to that, I know that Mr. Vogel has been doing some work based on the recommendations we made last time, and we'll come back and take a look at that as well and see how that is looking. It is a working document. It is not a final document. So we will take a look and go from there. So those are my thoughts on data that we'll take a look at today. Are there any other pieces of data that members of this subcommittee would find helpful for us to take a look at as a group today? Okay, well, with that, why don't we go ahead and, Mr. Vogel, would you pull up data set 3? And
Certainly, Mr. Chair. One moment.
Oh, actually, it looks like you have the state data up, so maybe this would be a better place to start.
Certainly, Mr. Chair, and yeah, sorry, I sort of anticipated how you'd want this to flow.
You're good. You're good. Let's start here. Mr. Vogel, would you walk us through the data you've been collecting? And members, let's think through, as Mr. Vogel's walking us through, how might we display this? Is there any additional analysis we need to do that will be helpful to the task force as a whole? So, Mr. Vogel, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to lead by essentially adding some words of caution about what I'm about to talk about. These are essentially notes I worked up, I think back in January, actually, working with the Remedies Subcommittee when they were interested in the question of what evidentiary standards are used by other states to make disqualification determinations. Major grain of salt here in 2 ways. First, that these are notes I worked up fast and essentially looking for just keywords in the relevant statutes. This is something that if we want to work with further, I probably want to budget some more time for. The second and much more important caveat is I worked with the Legislative Library staff to develop a list of statutes that are in some way equivalent to Minnesota Statute 245C, but that equivalency isn't absolute. And by that I mean some states, for example, will have a statute providing for background studies for childcare jobs or child fostering, and a different statute for example, working in a nursing home or that sort of thing. So it's not quite apples to oranges with all other states having one unified statute equivalent to 245C. So these are the statutes that I was looking at for these purposes. They tended to be the child care focused statutes, just because there's some really good documents put out by I believe the federal HHS that essentially list these statutes. But that's also something that just should be something that you take with a grain of salt. You introduced this, Mr. Chair, as a discussion of the use of the preponderance of evidence standard. But in a way, what this research really showed me in the remedy subcommittee was that conviction, rather than the preponderance of evidence or any other standard, is really the preeminent evidentiary standard used by other states to make a disqualification determination. It's often the explicit word used in state statutes. Some other state statutes don't really specify a precise evidentiary standard, but do imply conviction by providing for a criminal background check. I'm going to send a copy of this document actually to the whole subcommittee. I think most of you should already have it, but just in case. I suppose what I'd highlight mainly is states where the language didn't quite line up with that general rule of thumb. So Colorado, for example, has a substantiated findings standard for, sorry, Mr. Chair, I don't remember off the top of my head, to be honest, but for some disqualifications, but I believe not all. There's language of adverse finding for Nebraska that the applicant committed one of the crimes that disqualify them in Nebraska. There's an explicit provision for the use of juvenile evidence in the Tennessee statute I looked at, which I'm interpreting a statute that just provides for conviction to not be doing that. But that's, again, me potentially going out on a limb. Vermont provides for a substantiated finding of abuse as well as conviction, etc. So yeah, that's sort of what I've got, Mr. Chair. Sorry if that's a little unsatisfying, but this is essentially a jumping off point which I could use to work further on this if the group is interested. Oh, and I guess, Mr. Chair, I'd highlight that Wisconsin stood out to me. I focused on it a lot because it's a neighboring state. They use a conviction standard for disqualifications and a clear and convincing evidence standard with the burden on the individual to essentially do the equivalent of requesting a set aside, which, if I'm reading their statute correctly, there's no bar to their ability to do so.
Thank you. Thank you. How similar would you say we are to the other states in simple form based on your research, Mr. Vogel?
So I'd say we're dissimilar most prominently in our use of the preponderance of the evidence standard. We seem to be a little abnormal in the omnibus nature of our statute. And the list of crimes or conduct that are disqualifying in our statute, as a general rule, speaking off the top of my head, seems to be longer than the list that's explicitly provided for in a lot of other states' statutes. And then I'd highlight our use of a permanent bar, but I honestly wouldn't be comfortable characterizing how strange that is. I know certain states don't have that, but I couldn't begin to tell you how many off the top of my head.
Got it. Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, members of the subcommittee, based on what you're seeing here, do you believe that there's a way we could display this or analyze this any further that might be helpful to other committees or subcommittees, I should say?
I think it's really helpful. I mean, it might be at some point helpful to break it down into, just for the POE thing, you know, how many states have some version of it compared to those that don't. You know, I'm looking right now at Colorado under the statute that we'll put up there, and you know, it's interesting. It's licensing for this section. It's just really about foster care placements. But it would seem to me that if we had like some pretty rudimentary chart that showed all the states that don't use anything but conviction data, and then a separate that shows the ones that might have some version of it. But then I think we might need to sort of break it down with more research for each state, because like Connecticut, not Connecticut, I'm sorry. Am I looking at Colorado or Connecticut? Yeah, oh, I'm looking at Colorado, and there is some very loose language, but it wouldn't be like our preponderance of evidence piece. And maybe just having a paragraph about what this is. I know that's not like great, viewing.
Well,
It's
one of the things that was going through my mind, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is I was thinking about the feasibility of doing a graphic of the United States. There's populatable, charts that we could access online. And if there's a way we could categorize maybe, no use of POE as a particular color or shading, we could do that. And then we could have, another color or shading for, maybe minimal use of POE, or I'm just trying to think of the way to best classify this. It'll be helpful to other committees, but maybe no POE, some POE, or rampant POE, and for lack of better words, but or maybe just
maybe
yes or no.
is the term conviction, or because, like for example, Colorado is saying that, there are some non-convictions that would still be under the definition of conviction. Is the term so does that apply? So there are these, a deferred judgment. In this, would it be included as a conviction? And so deferred judgment, if you agreed to it and finished it and never were convicted, it would still count as a conviction. But there's no preponderance of evidence language. It's messy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Mr. Geffen, Mr. Chair, yeah, thank you for your feedback. And it's essentially reiterating what I sort of had in mind as I pulled all this up, which is, this is very preliminary, fast and dirty research that I did a couple of months ago. So just thank you for recognizing that.
Ms. Robertus, any thoughts from you on what could be helpful in this regard?
I don't think so. I think some of this is a tad over my head as it relates to some of the legal aspects of it that I might not understand. I think what would be most valuable, if you were to ask me what me and other groups I think would want to see, is where do we fall in that continuum scale of harshness compared to others in more comparable states, but how to interpret that with this. Can we do that? I'm not certain. But
thank you. Yeah, I differ back to Mr. Geffen. You have a legal background. Do you think there's a way that we could categorize what you're seeing here into the simpler categories, or is it just too complex to categorize into a couple simple categories for display? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conviction case states, I think, are pretty easy.
Yeah.
But I think I don't know if there are little caveats to each of these convictions. And some of them, even the definition of conviction could be different.
Would it be reasonable to categorize them as conviction only or other? If that makes sense.
I do think that's the way to do it. And whether or not we will have the time and ability to break down the other into something is I think the big question, but I think we could set it up with conviction other.
Got it. And Mr. Vogel, do you feel fairly confident for the states where you identified conviction? It is solely conviction. It is, that's your understanding, is that that's it, and and
I believe so, Mr. Chair, although I would want to go back and try to establish if there are any other statutes that might cover some parts of what 245C covers.
Got it. Got it.
Again, these are mostly child foster related statutes.
Yeah.
And I
And I
bet
think-
some states really don't have that sort of central background study statute. They
Yeah.
break it up to each, each one of those groups, like, oh, here's the foster care license, here's the child care license, here's if you want to be a CNA, and then that's a bit more of an abyss there. I mean, I'm willing to do some lifting on that too, and just spend some time going through this list and I'd love to do an analysis where we just sort of start with some of the highlighted ones that Will found that there's something unclear, and see if we can cement them in the conviction group, or if there is something more similar to what we do. And then at some point, I wouldn't mind going back and just not really double checking, Will, but just going through all the conviction statutes as time permits and kind of look at them.
I would certainly appreciate being double checked, Mr. Geffen. This was a lot of statutes. And
a lot.
And Mr. Chair, I can also go back over this, double check my past me essentially, and try to work up a more comprehensive list of relevant statutes as a jumping off point. So that may be the results of that may be a good discussion to have offline.
Yeah. And then once we have that, then how do we feel about a map? Does a map sound reasonable to see something graphically like that? And then we could also, I think, have additionally the spreadsheet like this that gives more detail. But I'm just thinking something that's going to be user friendly. It would be great to look at how many states are conviction only and how many do something else, just for quick reference. Thoughts?
Yeah, I love the map. Jolene, I'm sure you look at some of those incarceration websites that they have the map, and you put your your little icon over, and it shows how many people are incarcerated. I think it's a great way. We could do it where you go over it and it would pop up the statute, and I think that's a great idea, Roy.
Yeah. And I don't know that we'd create something interactive, but we could just do something very basic of, conviction only or other. Just
Jolene volunteered to make that.
the
The interactive map because of she's
Let me
on.
be clear. I wouldn't even know where to start. I'm like, I got the basics down for Word and Excel, and that's about it. So an interactive map might just set me over the edge.
I was going to say, I've used, I think it's like mapchart.net, which is very just basic for presentations and such. And you can like click states, choose a color. So it's very manual.
Mm-hmm.
And, unless we purchase some heavier duty software, of some sort, I think it'll have to be pretty low tech what we do. But again, I think something like that would be realistic. So, and I would offer to populate a map like that once we have, this a little, in more final form, just to go, yes, no, whatever the case might be. And I think that would be visually appealing for people to look at. Okay, any other thoughts or questions on the spreadsheet that Mr. Vogel has put together for us? I'm hearing next steps are Mr. Geffen will take a look at some of these other states and do some double check. Mr. Kammer has volunteered to populate a non-interactive map with the data. Any other tasks that I'm forgetting to restate here?
Mr. Chair, and I suppose to volunteer myself, I'll also double check my past work and try to make a more user-friendly and comprehensive overview of these statutes.
Now that legislative season is ending for a lot of states, go back through and see.
Oh yeah, did I change it? Yeah,
So,
that's a fair point.
so, okay, well, that sounds good. I think we can go ahead and wrap up that topic. Mr. Vogel, would you pull up data set 3 that has the POE data?
Certainly, Mr. Chair.
And can you scroll down?
I believe that'd be table 6. Let's see. Well, actually, I should highlight. So table 3 breaks down evidentiary standards that were used by race. Well, rather, table 3 does, and then table 3A and B do so by race and gender. So we have POE data broken down by race and then race and gender in table 3. But if I'm understanding you correctly, Mr. Chair, you want to see table 6, which breaks down crimes, disqualifying crimes by evidentiary standard, so we can see POE over here.
Yeah, and let me just restate what we heard from the Remedies Committee. Their request has been to take a look at POE. We had previously, talked about POE, by race, but the question has been, is there anything else as we go back and take a look at POE that might be helpful to their committee as they do more work regarding preponderance of the evidence? So I think what would be helpful to do is, maybe we go back to the initial table that had race and gender, and we can discuss would it make sense to, do some breakdowns regarding gender. Are there more things we could do in table 6? And Mr. Vogel, not to put you on the spot too much here, do you have access to any of the prior displays we created regarding POE and race?
Definitely, Mr. Chair. Just let me pull it up. Actually, I don't know if we've done a display on POE and race. We've done adjudication and race, but
yeah. So maybe okay, and that might be an opportunity for us where we just want to take a look at POE specifically by race.
I'd be interested in just seeing if the race numbers are consistent or if it spikes at all on the POE. Does that make sense, Roy? You know what I mean? Like, are the numbers, the same, throughout?
Right. Yeah. So taking a look at POE by race and then comparing it to, say, conviction by race and see if it looks similar and compare it to all of the different. Okay. Yeah. Think that makes sense.
So I'm currently displaying 2018 data from table 3, which has both conviction and POE by race. And so just eyeballing this, Mr. Chair, it's roughly 3,000 African-American disqualifications based on a conviction versus roughly 5,000, rounding up, white convictions, whereas it's pretty close for preponderance of the evidence. 200 versus 243.
Well, we're working here, so let's just do a rough calculation here. How does that sound in real time? So if we take a look at conviction again by race, we could take a look at, African. Oh, I'm sorry, and I think you have tables somewhere, so it might just have the numbers.
Yeah, no, sorry, Mr. Chair, I pulled up the spreadsheet version to just easier to calculate.
Absolutely.
All right, just a moment. So conviction. So you're gonna watch my terrible spreadsheet skills here.
Oh, you're doing a good job.
All right, so 32% of the total convictions in 2018 were African-American, 53% white, versus POE, that's, suppose I could do this more efficiently. POE, that's 40% of African American of disqualifications were African American versus 48% white. So there's a little bit of a disproportionate impact that we see there.
Yeah. Why don't we just do it for all the categories while we're
Yeah.
at it?
Could you do the permanent? Because the permanent seems really skewed on the
Definitely.
POE.
Definitely. Just a moment here. I think I've got that working. And then what I'll do is,
Wow.
yeah, we got some division by 0 there and division by unknown number. And then I'll just put these categories here just for the sake of clarity. Actually there we go. All right. So a vast swath of numbers, that obviously makes things clearer.
Well, let's just take it from the top. So we're 2018. And so we're looking at the totals right there. I think
Yeah, I'm just formatting this for readability.
I gotcha.
So yeah, 2018, 33% of disqualifications were in the African American category, 2% Asian or Pacific Islander, 6% Native American, 52% white. And then we have the none provided in unknown other categories.
Yeah.
Oh, Mr. Chair, Ms. Evans has come in, so we now have quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Vogel, and welcome, Ms. Evans. Okay, so adjudicated delinquent, we got a little bit higher percentage in African, I shouldn't say a little, I mean, what, 9% higher. So we see some variability there. Admission, this is interesting. I mean, 28% for African American, 1% Pacific Islander, Asian, 9% Native American, 7% unknown, and 55% white. And let's go down next category, Alfred, please. Alfred, please. We don't have enough to know.
Yep.
And then convicted, let's see, 32%. 20 for African American. 2% Asian Pacific Islander, 6% Native American, and 0% none. And then I need to move my Zoom images because it's blocking everything. And let's see, 7% unknown other than 53% white. So nothing too astounding there. And voluntary. And Mr. Geffen, what was it that you had wanted to see? You wanted to take a look at all of the permanents. Was that?
No, I was just looking at like permanent under conviction. You know, you see a spike on African American from 32% to 47%, and a significant lowering on permanence for convictions for the white population from 53 to 38.
Got it.
And then I think you see a similar number on preponderance of evidence on permanent bars. You see 40% of the preponderance of evidence cases being listed African American, but then it spikes under permanent again to 63%. They're not huge numbers really there, but unless you're one of them, I guess. But that was, I thought, surprising to see it spike that much for both preponderance of evidence and convictions.
Makes sense.
Did that post, was that the same too for juveniles?
Just a moment. Adjudicated delinquency. Yeah, 51%.
You're down in 2019 right now.
Oh, I apologize. Yes,
you're good.
So yeah, for 2018, still, we jump up to 48% from 42% African American.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
I mean, is that significant to others, or is that just I don't do all that well with numbers. So
No,
to me, that's significant.
yeah. Because I'm just trying to parcel it out in my head, because what we're saying then for permanent bars, we're just looking at the total number of permanents within that category.
Yeah, so yeah, just to make sure I'm clear. So the 48% here would be the percentage of this, of the 91%, or sorry, of the 91 permanent bars in 2018.
Yeah.
44 of that 91. Yeah, I feel like
Well,
that made it less clear.
I mean, isn't this though where we have to say that 48% doesn't mean that there's the same amount? I mean, the population of the African American community in Minnesota is far less than white, and so in that sense, this is quite significant. They make up a small portion of our community, yet they're showing up at a 50% rate here. I would say and if we don't incorporate that piece of information, it's going to be hard for us to tell if there is significance or not.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah,
Well,
pretty much half of the juvenile permanent DQs are African American kids.
yeah, which is significant.
When you look at it that way, John, 63% of the permanent preponderance of evidence cases are African American. Like when you say it like that, that's significant.
Yep. Agreed.
Say that one more time, Miss Evans. I want to make sure
So of the preponderance of evidence cases that end up being a permanent bar, 63% of them are African American.
Yep, that is it. Yep, thank you. Yeah.
And so that is significant. And then the opposite of that being that only 26% of them are white.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And then what's probably equally disturbing is when you take a look at less significant POE disqualifications. You go down to 7-year disqualifications. Only 35% of those are African American, and you take a look at whites, 54%. So part of my hypothesis going through my mind is, do we somehow, whether it be bias or I don't know, but why is it that, white individuals are more likely to end up with a 7-year disqualification based on POE, and African Americans are, it's almost like opposite, if that makes any sense. Let's see, let's go down to POE for 2019, Mr. Vogel.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Let's see. Again, I'll just be working as you work to increase.
You're awesome.
Thank you. All right, so adjudicated delinquent, 45% African American, 33% white. And then again, we see that number go up with permanency. Admission, 31% African American versus 52% white, which it looks consistent with 2018. Alfred plea, not enough data. Conviction, 35% African American versus 48% white. But again, we see a jump in permanent bars that's 46 versus 35%.
Right.
Let me know if me just talking through this is unhelpful, by the way.
Hey, that's what a working group does. A working group, we talk through it. So
Fair enough. Involuntary termination, 37 versus 43%. Maltreatment, 40 versus 43%. And again, as Ms. Roberta's pointed out, that roughly equal number does not represent Minnesota's population as a whole, far from it. And POE, 50% African-American, 34% white for all POE disqualifications, 65% African-American and 27% white for permanent bars based on the POE.
That seems pretty consistent from 2018 to 19. Is that accurate?
yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it. 40 versus 49, 63 versus 26. In fact, in 2019, it looks like the portion of disqualifications of individuals identified as white went down. Just a moment for readability.
The question here, taking a look at this, you know, what would be a few key points we would want to make that we would want to report back to the task force as a whole? Because Mr. Geffen, I suspect you'd like some report out from our subcommittee at the full task force tomorrow. What are there?
That would be great, but only if we're ready.
Yeah. Are there a few key points that we would want to share with the task force as a whole tomorrow?
So just FYI for you, Roy, the census 2021 for Minnesota, 83.8% white Minnesota and 7% black is what the census data showed.
You said
83.8% white and 7% black.
Yeah.
What's the language, Gina, that the census uses? Is it like so and so percent identifying themselves as?
Yeah.
I think we'd want to. Yeah.
And I believe the census reports racial information as some category alone versus multiple categories, the individual identified with multiple categories.
Yep. And then 2 or more is 2.6 if you wanted to add that. But
have we ever learned from the department how it determines somebody is African American or?
Yes, Mr. Geffen, actually, these are the categories used in the FBI's crime reporting database. I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it's not quite this. It's from what I understand, the standard reporting categories used in law enforcement. Not quite the same as the census, though.
And it's a box that pops up when you apply for a job, I think.
Okay.
And you can answer them or say, like that's where the unknown thing comes from, because you can choose not to answer it.
Gotcha. And Ms. Evans, since you have the census data pulled up, off the top of my head, I'm recalling that Minnesota's identified by the census is about 1% Native American. Is that correct?
1.4.
1.4. So I guess like off the top of my head, I'd highlight that 6% doesn't seem like a large number, but it's disproportionate to Minnesota's population as a whole.
Does anyone know how to do that math? Right, where you take that with the data set you're looking at?
Oh, gotcha.
And is that even appropriate in this data set? You know how they do that for even when they're doing health disparities and educational disparities and things like that, where they're showing some of that in a more equitable percentage points?
Yeah.
So like, right, for OUD, right, we were able to say African Americans are 6 times more likely to be impacted. American Indians are 8 times, just based on the percentage points. I don't know how to do that math. I probably could figure it out, but something like that, because we don't have to have the why about it, but we can tell you that at this point, African Americans are X times more likely to be impacted by a POE than their counterparts, or I don't know, just something to that degree. Or maybe I'm comparing apples to oranges. I'm not certain, Roy. I don't know if you can help me out here.
I think you're right on.
Yeah, I think, for some of these, specific points, so we could, for instance, if we went up to preponderance of the evidence, and we'll just, Mr. Vogel, if you could scroll down there to
Apologies.
to the POE, where we're at, we could say something to the effect of, see, and this is just, rough math, but I'd have to look at the raw numbers, but individuals who identify as African American are 3 times more likely to be permanently barred based on a preponderance of the evidence determination than individuals who identify as white, if that makes any sense. So, but yeah, we could do some of that for sure, if that would be.
So yes, Jolene, Roy does know how to do that math.
Yeah, we just got to look at smaller, the smaller pieces, but I think that's what we're kind of oohing and awing about as we go through here. It's like when you take a look at, I'm just looking at the 2019 POE, 27%, of the permanent disqualifications were individuals identifying as white, and just very raw, 65% of those permanent disqualifications based on POE were people identifying as African American. That's staggering. I mean, that's
Yeah.
huge. That's.
Do you think it would be nice? I mean, I always feel like there's like different data sets sort of resonate with people differently the way it's presented, and sometimes having multiple ways to say the same thing can be helpful. Like the way you just talked about it, Roy, like, it's 3 times more likely. That one clicked with me, as opposed to only the raw data. So I love the idea of putting it that way.
Yeah.
I like it too, right? Because we don't know the why, right? And I'm not certain where we're going to be able to figure out the why.
Agreed.
But this tells a story that is based in some raw data calculations, and maybe we don't need to know the why, right? But we know there's a problem here. We know there's an inequitable issue, and it deserves some attention. So sometimes when you do it that way, you don't have to define the why. And I think that's a little bit where on that last report, I think where DHS was like, if we remember, kind of had some stuff with, but by doing this, I'm not sure we have to explain much else. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's how I take it. It impacts me. It's like, okay, we got an issue here.
Do you think at some point, I mean, so I have, from my position, theories on some of this stuff, like that POEs are based on arrest records and police records, essentially police reports, and certain communities don't have great relationships with police, and certain communities are written up in different ways. And do you think it's our point to, I mean, I agree with you, Jolene, we're not going to know, but do we offer theory, or do we just totally stay away from that?
I would, sometimes when your data is so strong like this, I think the theory lives within it, without us having to, but I agree with you, right? There's so many things. Also, you think about, I mean, we've talked about this, it transcends into our sentencing with judges, and who gets harsher sentences, and who is arrested more frequently because they're stopped by police more frequently. It just goes on and on. And so I think when you just give this data, it just supports everything else in the disparities that we see. And you could recite those theories, but yeah, I too, even this was no offense to DHS too, but I sort of asked right away, it's like, do you take a look at your individual assessors and make sure they're making equitable decisions, not because they're doing it on purpose, but we all are subject to unconscious bias, whether you'd like to say so or not, you do. And so at the DOC, right, we look at our treatment terminations and our completions and making sure there's no red flags there. Not for anything intentional for the most part. It's not intentional. It's just what has happened. Anyways, I'm kind of on a diatribe, but I hear you. I wish there was more times where we could figure out the why behind it, but I'm not certain we'll ever get there. And so I think we could just get more questions than answers if we were to do so. But anyways.
And Mr. Chair, in case you can't see the raise hand function, Ms. Basham has raised her hand.
Oh, welcome, Miss Basham, and take it away.
I apologize, I'm late. I had a meeting run way over. But I love this conversation. And to this point, I found something that I think is informative on what we're discussing on converting between decimals and percents. And it says, I'm like, wow, this is much easier than I would have thought. To turn a number, an integer or a decimal into a percent, simply multiply by 100 and then convert over. So for example, 0.32 as a percent equals 32%, or 38.59 equals 38.59%, 0.02 equals 2. So I think the point there is, if we said something is 20% more likely to occur, we could say it's 2 times more likely to occur. But I'm going to keep looking while we're talking.
I was gonna say my simple calculation. So for instance, if we were looking at, if we're calculating occurrence and we're looking at likelihood of occurrence. So for instance, if we go to POE, you have 112 occurrences of permanent bars for African-American individuals, and you have 46 occurrences of permanent bars for white individuals. So you just simply take the 112 divided by the 46, which is like 2.7, and so basically it's it's about 3 times more likely to occur for African Americans than white individuals. Does that sound solid to others? Or maybe I just ran too quickly in my head.
As long as you think the math's right, I'm down. But yeah. I couldn't tell you otherwise. So
thinking back to my stats classes from days gone by. So I think we just have to be careful to say, to accurately label what we are labeling, And Mr. Vogel, can you walk us through what you are calculating down below?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So I was essentially just taking very literally what you said. So here I've got, for example, the 200 total African-American disqualifications in 2018 divided by the 243 white disqualifications in 2018, et cetera, down the line. Sorry, this is where I'm on a limb with numbers. Is that something we'd want to convert to percentages, or do these decimals do it?
And unfortunately, though, when we take a look at POEs as a total in 2018, I should say unfortunately, but just straightforward, there are more POEs for white individuals as a whole. So we can't say what we'd have to say is white individuals are slightly more likely.
But see,
Well,
they wouldn't.
well,
Right?
yeah.
because there's only 7% of our population in total is made up of people identify as African American or Black. And so that was sort of what I don't know how to do that conversion.
Yeah.
But there is a way to do that conversion because we see it a lot in our data that's presented through MDH and DHS and some of health and education outcomes, right? Where they take overall population and somehow transcend that into your data structure so it equalizes some of that.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So yes, there was 243, so there's 43 more white people as it relates to this issue. But when you look at the grand scheme of our population, that's this compared to this for Black people.
Got it.
Making sense? Am I making
Yep.
sense?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
So maybe too, it's less about the outcome and it speaks more to of this population, Black people are more likely to have to prove or like go forward with this process. I don't know.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Roberts, if I'm following, so these numbers would be essentially the chance, these numbers would represent the portion of African-American individuals versus white individuals of POE determinations. Whereas what we'd really want to do here is figure out of the 7% of Minnesotans who are identified as African-American, assuming the census lines up, what chance do they have, does somebody from that group have of being disqualified based on the POE versus what chance does somebody in the white group? Is that what you're thinking? Sorry, I may not be following well.
Yeah, but this is sort of why I was like, I wonder if this data set is like doing apples to oranges and maybe it's more goes, I don't know. This is where I may be. I know enough just to be dangerous for us, but.
I'm going to play around and probably screw up the math, so please ignore me.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think part of the complication for us is like we're so many layers in because, you know, we've got the population as a whole, but then we have to start taking a look, you know, at, you know, how we narrow it down. So we then have, you're not equal percentages of the whole population are all going to apply to positions that would require a DHS background check. So that's, you know, that's a limiting factor there. And then, you know, within that, you know, it just, because we've got multiple layers there, I'm just sorting through my head how we would do that. Because if an equal percentage of the population were applying for jobs that require DHS background studies that were equivalent to our ratios, our racial, you know, ethnic ratios from the census, it's easier to do. But we've got these complicating layers to go in. It's not just a quick apples to apples.
Yeah, and in fact, Mr. Chair, we know that it's I think not equal for
Right.
it's not a random selection of the Minnesota population that applies in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, table 2 of data set 1, distinct count of persons, I think would be what we'd want to get at that.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I think for us, if we want to do the, you know, the occurrence, you know, ratios, I feel most comfortable if we look at them, you know, within variable, you know, so we can say, you know, within, you know, POE, for instance, in 2019, you know, African Americans were, you know, you know, nearly 3 times more likely to have permanent bars than were individuals who identified as white. That we can say, but if we look, if we're trying to do the higher level, I think that might get, that would exceed my skill. That would exceed my skill. But I think there would be a lot of complexity there. So
Mr. Kammer,
yeah.
I have found, I think it's a fairly easy formula
Okay,
instead of like P2 squared, blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, this makes sense. And I'm just going to read exactly what it says, not to be
Yeah.
political, but they give a political example. The question is, how attainable, if at all, is the American dream for most people living in the US? The choices are attainable or not attainable among Democrats and Republicans.
okay,
The calculation is event A occurrences divided by event B occurrences.
yeah,
So for example, with the Democrats, it would be based on the chart I'm looking at. I would share it, but I don't think we can do that. In the call, it's 38% divided by 57%, which equals 0.66. This can be interpreted as for every 66 Democrats who believe X, 100 do not. Now, that's not answering directly the African Americans are 6 times more likely or 4 times more likely, but it is a pretty easy calculation, I think, for at least allowing us to say, out of this many of a certain, do you know what I'm saying?
yeah. Are you on towardsdatascience.com?
I am on, yes.
Yeah, I just.
Are you looking at the same thing?
Yeah, I was trying to find it as you're talking just so I could see what you were looking at.
That's hilarious. So if you, it's maybe 3/4 of the way down the page.
Yeah.
Do you see a grid?
Yep, with a glass and a bottle.
I wish I had a glass in a bottle. I don't see a glass in a bottle.
Oh.
But it says the title of the table is how attainable, if at all, do you think the American dream is for most people living in the US? They're just using this as an example of how to get to.
And Ms. Basham, Mr. Chair, if you're interested in displaying your screen, I think that should be technically doable.
Yeah.
I can stop sharing my end.
Ms. Basham, would you want to share?
I'd be happy to.
Cool.
Can we all see this now?
Yep.
I think this is the kind of a formula that would get to what we're talking about. So like in our case, we could, for disqualifications, for example, I'm just making this up because I can't look at both at the same time. The way I'm interpreting this is if, for example, Caucasians were 10% in the data we're looking at, we would divide, oh gosh, actually, how would we compare that? We would compare Caucasians to Caucasians. So we would say if Caucasians were 10% likely to have a disqualification overturned versus not, we would do 10 divided by 90, which would get us a number, and then compare that to the other group. If African Americans, again, I'm just making up the numbers to illustrate the point, if African Americans only 4% of their disqualifications were overturned, then we would say 4 divided by 96%. I don't know if that's still going to get us the 6 times more likely, 5 times more likely, but it is going to get us to, I mean, again, if we look at this second paragraph under this chart, this is a pretty significant odds ratio for every 464 Republicans who believe equality of life is achievable, 100 do not. Point being, if we could get to, for every 100 African Americans who seek getting a disqualification overturned, only, again, I'm making it up, only only 4 of them will achieve that compared to Caucasians at. Or again, we could add up all of the minority groups like we were talking about last time. So it's not.
Right. Yeah, gives us a little bit bigger population to work with. So,
There's the bottle.
yep, there's the bottle. So,
I'm going to stop sharing this now.
yeah, thank you. I would just go back to, oh, go ahead, Ms. Robertus, you were gonna say.
I would leave there's a reason why, I didn't get into med school, and statistics and chemistry were the two. But I'm doing some, looking and if I'm reading some of this stuff correctly and I don't know how to interpret it, there is, what they call a disparity ratio or disparity decision point calculation. And it's called a DR, disparity ratio measurement method. I don't know if someone who understands statistics could take a look at that. That's what I'm reading and that's what I'm hearing it called, but.
Yeah. It is something I'd have to take a look at quicker. I haven't calculated disparities like that before.
Sure.
But it's not to say that we couldn't do it, or I couldn't tap into someone I know that might be able to help me out that does more disparity work. So yeah, I think it's worth considering. I think in the meantime, go ahead.
It looks like they use it a lot in so like all child reports, accepted referrals, victim, foster care, in foster care, exit foster care, and they're able to do that and calculate disproportionate rates based on some of those systems. Yeah. So I'm seeing it heavy in the children sector, but anyways.
Do you think, Roy, that we should, I think that just using the raw data and putting it before the full committee tomorrow, and putting it specifically more into the group for remedies that's looking at the POE, and ask them how they might want the data kind of organized, makes some sense too, just so we don't create ways that they don't want.
Right, that makes sense. What I might propose is if we go back to the spreadsheet that Mr. Vogel had open, is it'd be good to say this is what we've done. I would entertain the idea of just saying here are some things notable to us, and also we're willing to do a little, dig a little deeper and create some charts, tables if we're on the right path. But what would be helpful to the rest of you as we take a look at the disqualifications based on determination type here. So I think that's how I would approach it. Just simply explaining this is what we've done. These are percentages, and see what else they'd like us to do. Because I think we can talk freely enough about some of these areas when we take a look at say POE and just show them POE in 2019 as a whole for preponderance of the evidence 65% of the individuals who were disqualified based on POE were African American, and only 27% were white. When you take a look at this more granularly, those who, and I think I was on the wrong line there. So I think POEs as a whole in 2019, 50%, I'm sorry, were African American and 34% were white. But then taking a look at, permanent bars, 65% who were determined based on POE for permanent bars were identified as being African American, and 27% were white. That's frustrating. That's frustrating. And to see if this is the type of data they're looking at, or interested in? And if so, we can come back next time. We can create some tables that do probably a little bit, that display it a little bit, more visually, if that makes any sense, and go from there. Thoughts, questions? I mean, where I'm seeing a thumbs up. Thanks, Mr. Geffen. Others, how do you feel about that approach for tomorrow?
I think that sounds like a great approach for tomorrow. I also just messaged, but I know we won't hear from her today, but one of the directors in my area oversees data and performance management. So I just messaged Carrie and I said, how do we do this?
Yeah. Cool. And let us know what you find out. If not, I have a colleague who is an epidemiologist who does a fair amount of disparity work. So I imagine she may be able to give me some guidance as well on a disparity calculation. So yeah. Nonetheless, I think we've got some data here that are interesting. I think they're compelling. Hopefully we're on the right track for what the remedies committee is looking for. Ms. Evans, I know that I believe you participate in that committee, and do you think we're on the right track?
I do. And I think, Will, do we have some graphs that we put together for preponderance of evidence? I know remedies is meeting next week. Is it next week?
Yes, Ms. Evans.
To talk about preponderance of evidence. And I think just, having this data like pulled out from all of this other data to be able to look at, and then having the population information together, and like just having this information separate for them to be able to look at, and I think we'll be good. And so I don't know what you got going on this week, Will, but if we can get it together. And I know we did some other work on this before as well, to be able to get to them.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I was trying to remember if I'd worked up specifically the POE thing for the data subcommittee. But even if I didn't as a PowerPoint, I did do the groundwork. This spreadsheet that I'm displaying right now ranks the various disqualifications from disqualifying crimes from Table 6 of Data Set 3 by POE. So, for example, the 15-year disqualifications in 2018. 2.9% of the theft disqualifications were from POE, and then it's very small numbers after that, and 0%. I'd highlight in the 7-year disqualifications, we see 41.6% domestic assault DQs were based on a POE standard, which informally, from what I understand, is what the department is aiming for. Without wishing to speak for the department, they've highlighted in conversations with me that domestic assault is a concern of theirs that they like to use POE for, but POE is a useful tool. I don't think I'm violating any confidences by telling you that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I can definitely use this as a basis for highlighting POE usage in a chart. I need to figure out what's a good way to display the data, since it's these various evidentiary various disqualification periods. But yeah.
Yep. So it seems like you have the data in another form, and so I feel like as we're looking at things in an individual way, there's just so much data. So to be able to just like, even if you pulled the rest of that data out of this and just had the POE on each one.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the stuff that we just talked about with how it compares white, black, and if we have any substantial Native American data. It didn't look like we did have very much. was all value. So
Yeah,
I think that
I
would be
don't
a good
believe we
place to
have,
start.
yeah, I don't think we have tables 3 and 6 cross-referenced. That is to say, disqualifications broken down by crime and evidentiary standard and race of the applicant. So that'd be a limitation there. Mr. Chair, Mr. Robertus's hand's up also.
Ms. Robertus.
Oh, and I'm not even muted. How long have you guys been hearing me work over here? I know I might be belaboring this, but I actually think I might have this figured out, believe it or not. So it's a fairly simple calculation, but the race disparity index is simply the percent of the race group particular in that decision point, right? So we would have 32% and 40%, correct? Let's say use African Americans.
In which category, Ms. Robertus?
Preponderance of evidence. Oh, so 50%. It's going to be even worse. So 40 and 50 for African American.
Yep, so African American, you have 50% POE in 2019.
Okay. And so you take that percent of race group in that particular decision point and you divide it by the percent of the same race group base population. So it would be 50% divided by 7%, which I need to calculate still. But if you 40% divided by 7%, it gives you a 5.71, which means it's Black people are 5.71 times more likely to be impacted at this decision point overall.
Let's walk through that together one more time, just so we got it.
Yep. So in this, I found on just a racialist, like a ROM training video.
Yeah.
But it's a simple calculation that says, sorry. So you've seen in previous slides. Okay, so disparity calculation is the percent of a race group at a particular decision point compared to the percent of the same race group in a base population. So you just simply divide these two percentages to calculate the disproportionality index.
Got it. So for African American individuals, we're taking 50%, and this is our decision point, divided by 7% in the general population.
I mean, this is how I understand it, and this is how I understand how they do things too with like some of those other common disparities that are frequently looked at, like health outcomes and whatnot. But so it's 0.50 divided by 0.07, which gives you a
Index of 0.71.
So it would shift 7.14. Did I do that right?
Yeah.
Anyways, you can double check my math, but I think it's almost, it might be that simple.
Got it.
It makes sense when, like, if you're looking at an overall population and impact from a system and a decision point.
Yeah. And if we're using percentages against percentages, that would make sense. So yeah, I just want to, if we're publicly displaying any of it, I want to make sure I'm feeling comfortable.
I'm not sure we need to publicly display this yet, but I think this is how they do this for many things.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, Mr. Chair, we are publicly displaying this right now.
Correct. Oh yeah,
fortunately for the public.
Yeah, we're stumbling through it right
Yeah.
now on live TV.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. I do a fair amount with data, and I just have to be honest. I don't calculate race disparities on a regular. Haven't calculated race disparities on a regular basis. So just want to
So
make
that
sure
would be 7 times is what, if that holds true, it would be that they're 7 times more likely to have a permanent bar because of a preponderance of evidence finding.
I would say it means that they're 7 times more likely to be impacted at that decision point. So strictly, you're Black, therefore, due to these calculations, you are 7 times more likely to be impacted than your white counterpart. Anything above 1.0.
When you say that, like, moment, what is the moment exactly? That's what I get lost on.
They keep using this term decision point, like decision. So
Okay.
I don't know. I don't,
Is it the decision point to do a preponderance of evidence, or is the decision point to do the permanent bar?
I used preponderance of, I did the, so the percentage point I used was the preponderance of evidence.
And the population. So that was the preponderance of evidence for 2019 is the data point you used. 50%.
And I can't tell from this, does this mean that 50% get a permanent bar due to the preponderance of evidence?
No, that was the number you used, was that 50% of preponderance of evidence. That's the total number of preponderance of evidence cases are African Americans in 2019. That was overall. That was the overall number.
Okay, so maybe we would actually need to look at the result of that decision point. I'm not certain. See, this is where I know enough to be troublesome, but
Good
take
trouble,
a look at some of this
Good
stuff.
trouble.
I think take a look some of this stuff, Roy, because I think if you were to read some of this and they work through various scenarios, it might click or resonate stronger with you than myself. But
Yeah, and I think I just need to do a little homework just to make sure I'm freshened up and making up to speed on it. So yeah, it's making sense. So well, cool. Yeah, I think that's where we want to go with it. I feel like we even that set aside, we've got some good data here, just looking at percentages. We just want to take it further and look disparity, against when we think about population as a whole. So yeah, for tomorrow, I think we'll stick with plan, and Mr. Vogel, I just asked if you're willing to have this updated spreadsheet ready to go. We can talk a little bit about what we've done, highlight a few of the key points, get some feedback from the task force about, what else might be helpful with this data, and then we can kind of mine through it a bit more. We can also, I know Ms. Basham has reached out to one of her data colleagues. I will reach out to one of mine that, does frequent disparity calculations that we're talking about and such, and just to kind of run this methodology by them and just make sure we're on point before we, display it anywhere, just so that we're feeling sure about it. So yeah, I think that's good. So let me ask, we are at about 2:22. Are we at a good breaking point? Do we want to dig into anything else today? How's the subcommittee feeling? I know we're scheduled till 3:00. Would we be willing to take a look at some of the updates Mr. Vogel made based on some of the feedback we gave at the last meeting? Or let me pause. Do we want to take a closer look at any of this or discuss key points we'd want to share with the task force tomorrow? Let me, I'll rewind there.
I have to leave at 2:30.
Okay.
So, and I'm feeling fairly tapped, but if people are willing to keep going and fighting the charge, great. I also just want to thank the committee for entertaining kind of my prolonged point on.
It's a good point.
I've got to leave it. I have a student appointment at 2:30. I apologize too.
Oh, you're good. You're good. So why don't we call this good for today? I will be prepared to walk through this at a high level tomorrow for the task force, Mr. Geffen. So be ready for that. And then when we come back together 2 weeks from today, Ms. Basham, maybe you've heard from your colleague and maybe I've heard from mine, and we can take a look to see if we can do some disparity indexing there, and If not, we'll move forward with what we got here and with what feedback we get from the task force tomorrow. Next time we meet, Mr. Vogel, will you also tuck away that we'll come back and take a look at those updates you had made to some of the tables based on the feedback we gave at our last meeting, and I suspect we'll have a full agenda for next week too.
Sounds good,
I
Mr.
think
Chair.
next week for 2 weeks from today, I should say, our next meeting. And let me just check in now that we're 2 meetings in. I feel like we've been working hard when we've been together. Is 2 hours going to be too long? Would an hour and a half be sufficient so we don't tap our brains? Too much, or does 2 hours sounds good? What are your thoughts as a committee?
I think having it scheduled for 2 hours and then being done when we're done is, like, this was a good stopping point. Like, we got through all of this stuff, and like starting something new at this point felt like a little bit. And so, like, I think leaving them for 2 hours, and like, if we were still moving on, like keeping going would have been great. And now because we stopped, and so I'm okay with leaving it for 2 hours. And if we end early, that's great. But I'm open to what others are thinking.
And Mr. Chair, along those lines, I actually sort of had a question for you and the members. So you may have noticed I've scheduled these meetings out for the rest of June, but I wanted to basically hear from you how you're envisioning meeting long-term over the year, like if I should schedule meetings out for July and August as well. As you may recall, I think we've had some behind-the-scenes discussions about the subcommittees trying to get their work wrapped up by the end of August. So, like, for example, does this subcommittee want to keep meeting up to that point?
I would propose that we keep them on the calendar through the end of August, every 2 weeks, same time. And hopefully we'll have most of our work done by then. And we'll go from there. Does that sound okay with the rest of the committee? Okay.
We'll send those out then.
Okay. Any other comments before we wrap up today? Well, thank you everyone for digging in and doing good work. Thank you all for sharing your voices. It's important. So we pull this data together in good ways. So thank you. Thank you for chiming in. Thank you for sharing. And I'll look forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks, and many of you tomorrow morning for the full task force meeting. So thank you, and we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting at 2:27 p.m.